China and the Philippines, two countries that have had hundreds of years of interaction as neighbors. From the time the first Chinese traders came to our shores, many more came to the Philippines to work, raise families, and even to make their fortunes. For centuries, the two countries enjoyed a state of peaceful coexistence with their peoples living in harmony. Philippines-China relations are long-standing and multifaceted indeed. But with China emerging as a leading global power, there is also some concern about its possible negative impact on the welfare and security of the Philippines and of China's other smaller neighbors.
We are entering a new stage in international politics where China's influence is rapidly growing. It therefore makes sense for us to take stock of our relationship. Are the two countries economically interdependent? Are our economic ties mutually beneficial? Are our political relations strong enough to withstand territorial disputes and nationalist emotions? Is China's rise a threat or an opportunity for the Philippines?
In this video, we bring together relevant data and ask expert academics and practitioners what their expectations and aspirations are for Philippines-China relations going forward.
Join us as we explore different aspects in Philippines-China ties in tourism, trade, investment, natural resources, and national security. We will also examine broader developments in the Asia-Pacific region and how this affects their relations. I am Cara David, and this APPFI documentary is an overview of Philippine relations with the world's next superpower.
China has been one of the Philippines' top trading partners in the last 15 years. In 2016, it was our biggest trading partner. Since the beginning of the 21st century, globalization and the development of regional production networks had allowed Philippines-China trade to grow rapidly. These are the products both sides export to each other. From the year 2000 until 2007, trade was growing by 30 to 40%. But the global financial crisis in 2008 brought an overall decrease in demand for electronic products, which temporarily led to lower Philippine exports to China. From 2011 to 2015, tensions relating to the West Philippine Sea territorial disputes continued to escalate, and yet trade increased during this period. Exports to China declined again in 2015 and 2016.
China's economic slowdown, we know, happened during this period. There was also rebalancing. That means China started to focus more on domestic consumption rather than exports and investments.
Now, what do these comparisons tell us? Trade with China is affected by several factors, including the global financial crisis, China's economic performance and policy changes, and to a lesser extent, political tensions brought about by the West Philippine Sea dispute. How badly can the Philippines be affected by fluctuations and disruptions in our trade with China? Some people worry that our economy is very vulnerable, especially to external security shocks.
Trade, this is trade with China, is less than 5% of our GDP. And if we consider the fact that 7 to 80% of our trade with China is in processing of the production network, then the non-processing products are just about 1 to 2% of GDP. This suggests that the impact on the Philippine economy in case of China's slowdown or if we stop to trade with China, it's not going to be significant.
But Dr. Palanca points out that this could also mean we have not been capitalizing on China's huge market. Whether trade volumes rose or fell, Philippine total trade with China is still low compared to its ASEAN neighbors, ranking only 6th among all ASEAN members. Trade with China is only 15% of the Philippines' total trade, behind that of Malaysia and Thailand, which are both at 16%, and Indonesia, which is at 17%. But this also shows that there is still much room for growth in trade in areas that the Philippines should further explore.
Exports performance is vital to economic growth, so we have to focus on this. And China provides the opportunities, okay? It has a huge market, it's a growing market.
With China's current focus in improving its domestic demand and its increasingly sophisticated consumers, there will be more opportunities for Filipino exporters to compete if they learn to innovate and improve their products. The Philippines has the lowest public infrastructure investment in Southeast Asia at only 2.5% of GDP. This hinders the steady flow of private investments and overall economic efficiency. China is not a major source of foreign investments for the Philippines, but there are expectations of a windfall in infrastructure investment, especially after President Duterte's visits to Beijing in October 2016 and May this year. Is the Philippines well-positioned for a major inflow in Chinese infrastructure investments? To increase the Philippines' competitiveness and the ease of doing business, the government needs to build infrastructure, thus enhancing mobility and increasing passenger cargo throughput by addressing the congestion problems in existing transport facilities.
President Duterte's agenda aimed to accelerate the annual infrastructure spending to account for at least 5% of the gross domestic product from a measly 1.8% of the gross domestic product in 2011. China, an emerging player in the infrastructure sector and in the Philippines' longtime partner, may fit the bill of an active collaborator in infrastructure development.
According to Dr. Reynoso, there are 4 reasons why China can be an excellent partner in infrastructure funding. First, Chinese loans are concessional. Second, China can rapidly commit large amounts. Third, the Chinese are responsive to timelines. And fourth, China has a comparative advantage in terms of technology, equipment and materials, and human resources. Another source of infrastructure financing is the Chinese-initiated Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIIB. The Philippines is a member of this new multilateral institution and has shown interest in borrowing from AIIB. However, there are challenges the Philippines faces in borrowing funds from China. We need to learn from our experiences of a decade ago when big projects like the National Broadband Network and the North Rail project were found to be mired in corruption.
More specifically, the perception of the lack of transparency and competition in procurement. Philippine laws, as we all know, require government procurement to be subjected to open competitive bidding and other forms of price competition. The bilateral economic cooperation relations between the Philippines and China is marked with both challenges and successes. As we enter a crucial point in our lives as nations, it is important that we take the lessons learned from our experiences into consideration.
According to the United Nations World Tourism Organization, China is the world's largest market for outbound tourism, both in terms of numbers of outbound travelers and tourism expenditure. In 2016, there were 135 million Chinese tourists overseas, spending a total of $261 billion. The Philippines in the same year was only able to attract less than 1% of the Chinese market, with roughly 676,000 Chinese tourists visiting the country.
I wanted to show where we are vis-a-vis Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore. For example, Thailand has 7.9 million Chinese arriving, and we only have 490,000. Vietnam last year had 1.7 million. This in spite of tensions also between Vietnam and China, but they were able to get 1.7 million. We got 490,000 arrivals.
The Philippines is still a small player in the China tourism market. Did the West Philippine Sea dispute affect our tourism's poor performance?
Our arrivals from China have been very erratic. It goes up and down, okay? But 2013 showed a very high growth because in 2012, the charter flights direct to Calibo, Clark, Puerto Princesa, Cebu were suspended because of the standoff in the Scarborough Shoal. So when there was a negative travel advisory, so when those charters were stopped and then quiet negotiations without any fanfare were held between the Secretary of Tourism and the head of the China National Tourism Administration, then the charters came back. We always say tourism is apolitical, it should not be politicized, but it is political. So it does affect the arrivals.
The industry must therefore make sure it is resilient, even with these challenges. That means improving our airports, hotels, safety, security, and services to continue to attract the higher-end China market.
The Philippines is one of the most mineral-rich countries in the world. The Mines and Geosciences Bureau estimates that the Philippines has $840 billion worth of untapped mineral wealth.
China, on the other hand, has huge demand but low domestic supply of mineral products. What role does China play in our mining industry?
These are the main commodities that we have: iron, gold, copper, nickel, and chromite. Okay. From the perspective of China, these are the ores that they are mostly interested with us. Primary of them is nickel.
Roughly 30 million tons of raw Philippine ores is exported to China every year since Indonesia passed a law stopping export of raw materials in 2014. From a trade perspective, we have an advantage since we are China's largest source of nickel.
Nickel, along with chromium and iron, are the main ingredients of steel. And China is the biggest producer of steel, and they don't have iron and nickel in their geology. They have to source it out.
Now we look at China's involvement in small-scale mining in the country, where China is already a major player.
70 to 80% of the Philippine gold production does not come from the big mining companies. It comes from small-scale mining. Most of that gold, especially from Mindanao, are being sold in planes that land there in Davao. I don't know where, most probably China, and then India. So it is not listed in our trade in our trade values, but that's quite substantial.
China has influenced small-scale mining abuses, bringing their own labor, bribing for permits, disregarding environmental concerns, and rehabilitation practices.
These are the continuing problems we face with China in our mining industry. Although we have a trade advantage due to China's huge demand for nickel, we need better regulation of our mineral production and exports.
When one talks about the recent Philippine-China relations, the first thing that comes to mind is the South China Sea dispute. This is a long-standing issue since the 1970s, but it became more significant in recent years due to several factors. We look at 4 themes related to the territorial disputes: the arbitration ruling, China's strategic considerations, the U.S. factor, and ASEAN's role. The Philippines tried to resolve its disputes with China using the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, which both countries have ratified. In January 22, 2013, the Philippines filed a case before an international arbitral tribunal in The Hague, Netherlands, accusing China of violating Philippine maritime rights as granted by the convention. China did not participate in the case, and when the ruling came out favoring the Philippines, China rejected the arbitration ruling.
So whatever claims China might have had in the past, these were basically relinquished. They were abandoned or given up as part of the package deal of UNCLOS. Second, since what is right and wrong in the South China Sea has been determined authoritatively, you now have a clear basis for saying what is right or wrong in terms of claims, allocation of maritime rights and resources. This gives us supposedly negotiation leverage.
Law and diplomacy are important instruments for addressing disputes, but security risks and regional dynamics are also factors that must be considered. First of all, we need to understand China's own strategic considerations. Former journalist and now Philippine ambassador to China, Chito Santarumana, talks to us about Chinese thinking on this issue.
You all know, or you've heard about the China Dream. And the basic components of this would be to have a prosperous China with a strong army under the leadership of a Communist Party. As Xi Jinping puts it, China will not accept any proposition or action based on the decision of the arbitral tribunal. China's territorial sovereignty and maritime interests in the South China Sea, under any circumstances, will not be affected by the award.
If this is China's position, is there still a reason to talk to them? Or will the two sides just end up in a stalemate?
While China has come out with a statement that is full of bluster, at the end of the government statement on July 12th, after the ruling was announced, there was actually a manifestation of a soft line, which read as follows: pending final settlement of the dispute, China is ready to enter into provisional arrangements of a practical nature, including joint development in the relevant maritime areas in order to achieve win-win results. But the term provisional arrangement of a practical nature, this is actually UNCLOS language. This is language that is also part of general international law. And it shows a possibility where you could advance and move forward.
Santarumana believes that the real challenge is in finding ways to move cooperation forward, such as in trade, tourism, fisheries, marine environment protection, anti-drugs and anti-crime campaigns.
Basically, how to live, how to exist peacefully despite the fact that you have disputes in principle, and how to be able to move forward.
Since the Duterte government took over in 2016, relations between the Philippines and China have significantly improved. Yet China's posture in the South China Sea is also influenced by the role of the other major power in the region, the United States. The Philippines' alliance with the U.S. dates back nearly 70 years to 1951, and it affects the Philippines' relationship with China.
In the last 2 years, there has been much talk about an impending power transition or a power shift, where you have China as a rising power and the United States as a perceived declining power. Now, these two powers, of course, US and China, are driven mainly by their geopolitical interests in our part of the world. It's US trying to sustain its primacy, which it has enjoyed for close to 100 years. And China trying to create strategic space for itself. And it is as well a contest for the right to shape the rules, the right to shape the new architecture, the future regional and world order. So who has a place at that table where these decisions will be made? China very much feels that it has gone very far. It deserves a place at that table, and it demands a place at that table. And this is why we see China becoming so assertive and interested in leadership on several fronts that it did not used to be interested in.
The question for China is, what are its long-term interests? Will it promote regional stability? And will it uphold international norms?
China's long-term, strategic interest would seem to demand that it should stand for rules-based order. No? If China says that it can be a provider of public goods, that provision of public goods has to be based on rules and common norms and so on. If China says that it can be a leader in international economic or financial or whatever issues, then that leadership will have to be anchored on commonly accepted conventions and so on.
China, on the other hand, given its close economic relations with ASEAN countries, must find ways to rebuild trust and reduce suspicion from its neighbors. University of the Philippines political science professor Herman Kraft talked to us about the China-US-ASEAN dynamics.
The Philippines could opt for one extreme, no, that is to say, basically accept the increasing competition between US and China as the future context within which the Philippines has to navigate its interests, no? In which case it will have to accept that ASEAN will have a much more diminished role strategically, okay? And so emphasize more the relationship with the United States. It could try to strengthen ASEAN or push toward the strengthening of ASEAN, no, but at the same time keeping the two superpowers engaged economically and politically. Now, of course, the problem is how to operationalize this kind of strategy.
Economic interdependence within the region may still provide the key to regional stability. Economic benefit provides a strong reason for the big powers to continue engagement and avoid moves that would harm economic ties. Cooperation on issues like climate change should also be a priority of big powers.
So we have to have collaborative people-to-people activities, and if regional connectivity were the answer, it must be prefaced on a more environment-friendly planet, because that is exactly the challenge as we see from day to day, week to week in the headlines of all the world.
A shared cultural heritage, historical ties, and long-standing economic interactions characterize Philippines-China ties. In more recent years, differences have emerged over sovereignty and rights to resources, compounded by geopolitical competition between the big powers. Such challenges are expected to continue. As former ambassador to ASEAN Dr. Wilfrido Villacorta said, in dealing with China, we must not forget that it is not a monolith and is not beyond change. Hence, we should not give up on China because there are many opportunities that the country may offer.
The Bahay Chinoy Museum is a good reminder of Philippines-China relations. The relationship between the Philippines, China, and their peoples continues to hold great potential. Together with their neighbors, the two countries have a shared responsibility of promoting peace and stability and achieving greater progress and prosperity for the region and the world. I'm Cara David, and this is the APPFI documentary on Philippines-China relations.